Good evening here in New York. Ohayo gozaimasu to all of you joining from Japan. I'm Joshua Walker at Japan Society. I'm really excited today to be talking about a very timely topic, the Okinawa and U.S. Japan security alliance in critical times. As somebody who grew up in Hokkaido, which is outside the mainland of Honshu, Japan, I have a special affinity and connection to Okinawa because those of us that have lived outside the mainland have always known the diversity and the richness of Japan that sometimes isn't as fully appreciated. So today I'm really excited to talk to two experts that know a lot about this very particular and very unique region of the world that oftentimes is either only known for some of the tragedies in terms of the war and also the U.S. bases there, but also in terms of the beauty and the archipelago that is a tourist haven for many. So today's webinar is going to explore the crucial role of Okinawa that it's played in U.S.-Japan security relations. What is Okinawa's role in U.S.-Japan relations to be able to explore deeper? And will it remain a strategically important hub given the military bases there? This event is actually part of a much larger Okinawa in Focus programming series for the Japan Society. It's a year-long series that commemorates the 50th anniversary of Okinawa's reversion to Japan from the United States. So my job is to simply thank our sponsors for business and policy here, our global leader, Citi, our corporate partners, Deloitte, Mizuho Americas, Toyota Motor North Americas, and then to introduce our speakers. First, we'll be hearing from Masaaki Gabe Sensei. He's emeritus professor of the University of Ryokukus, and Professor Sheila Smith, who's at the Council on Foreign Relations. She's the John E. Muir Senior Fellow for Asia Pacific Studies. But before we dive into that conversation, we actually have a special video message that we brought in from the Honorable Yasuhiro Denny Tamaki, who's the governor of Okinawa. So let's hear from the governor before we get into our conversation.
ハイサイグスーヨーチューガナビラ、まずは沖縄の言葉でご挨拶をさせていただきましたが、皆様こんばんは。沖縄県知事の玉城デニーです。沖縄は1945年の太平洋戦争において日本国内で唯一住民を巻き込んだ悲惨な地上戦の場となり、20万人を超える多くの尊い命が失われました。戦後、沖縄は日本の施政権から分離され、27年にわたり米軍の統治下で軍事優先の政策が取られました。この間、県民は人権が尊重されない困難な生活環境に置かれたことから、日本の平和憲法の下での基本的人権の保障を強く願うようになりました。そして、長きにわたる復帰運動を経て、1972年5月15日に日本への復帰を果たしましたが、基地のない平和の島は実現せず、米国が軍事基地を継続して使用する形での復帰となってしまいました。そして本年2022年5月15日に日本復帰50年という大きな歴史的な節目を迎えています。日本に復帰後、沖縄県は社会資本が整備され、観光産業や情報通信関連産業が成長し、社会・経済の発展が進みました。一方、米軍基地に関しては、わずか 0.6% の県土面積に日本全体の 70.3% もの広大な米軍専用施設が占めており、騒音、水質汚染などの環境問題、米軍関係の事件・事故が後を絶たないことに加え、都市計画づくりや産業の立地など、沖縄の振興にも大きな障害となっております。特に市街地の中心に位置している普天間飛行場は、住民生活に著しい影響を与えており、同飛行場の危険性除去はまさに喫緊の課題です。日本政府は辺野古移設が唯一の解決策であるとして、辺野古埋め立てに反対する圧倒的多数の民意を顧みることなく、埋め立て工事を強行しています。しかしながら、移設先の海底はマヨネーズ並みと言われる軟弱地盤の存在が判明し、提供手続きの完了までに約12年を要するとされ、さらに沖縄防衛局が提出した変更承認申請が公有水面埋め立て法に照らした厳正な審査の結果、不承認となり、埋め立て工事全体を完成させることがより困難な状況となりました。沖縄県としては、辺野古移設では普天間飛行場の一日も早い危険性の除去にはつながらないと考えており、日米両政府には同飛行場の国外、県外移設について再検討していただきたいと考えています。5月15日の日本復帰50年に先立ち、沖縄県では平和で豊かな沖縄の実現に向けた新たな県議書を発表し、戦後77年 復帰後50年にわたり沖縄を苦しめてきた基地問題の解決を改めて日米両政府に訴えています。詳しい内容については沖縄県ワシントン事務所のホームページに掲載されていますので、ぜひご覧ください。日米両政府においては、武力によらない手法で国及び地域間の協調を基本とする外交に取り組み、アジア太平洋地域の対話による平和と持続的な協力と発展を図っていただきたいと考えております。本日のウェビナーはシーラ・スミス博士と我部正明先生による対談と聞いております。さまざまな視点から有意義な議論がなされることを期待しております。最後になりますが、今回ご参加の皆様におかれましては、日本復帰50年を迎えた沖縄に改めて思いを寄せていただき、沖縄県民が望む平和で豊かな沖縄の実現に向けて、私たちと協調してくださいますよう切にお願いいたします。ゆたさるぐとにうにげやさびら、よろしくお願いいたします。一平二平デービル、ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much to the governor. Let's start with Gabe Sensei there in Okinawa. What's your reaction to the governor's comments there?
Last request made by Governor Tamaki is based on the Okinawa history. And I think that it sums up the voice of many Okinawans. For example, the 200,000 people lives were lost in Battle of Okinawa 77 years ago. And more than half of them are civilians because 1 in 4 died. As a result, there has been the continual aversion to the war among the surviving Okinawans. They want to see the problems that arise between the nations that lead to the war resolved through the discussion, not through the force. They have learned from the lesson of the Battle of Okinawa, war caused civilian casualties. Okinawan people believe war should be avoided. This is extremely common sense.
Thank you very much. Sheila Sensei, how about from you?
Well, thank you, Josh. First of all, let me thank you for doing this. I think we don't often have occasions to talk about what's happening in Okinawa and why it's so important that we understand it. And we rarely get a chance to talk to our colleagues, such as Professor Gabe from Okinawa. So thank you for having us. I think I would agree with Gabe Sensei. I mean, the consequences, no one understands the consequences of war more than the people of Okinawa. It was the site of the battle, the only homeland battle of Japan in 1945. It was a bloody conflict with extremely high casualties, as Gabe-san pointed out. It also destroyed the island. It destroyed the environment of the island, and it forced many Okinawans into repatriation camps on other parts of the island. So there was a lot of hardship suffered by the people of Okinawa in 1945, and it took 27 years for them to be reunited with Japan during the reversion process that we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of today. But there's something equally important than the message about the consequences of war, and that is it reminds us, as we think about the U.S. Japan alliance, as we think about our roles in the region, the Indo-Pacific region, which, as we are going to talk about, is quite volatile these days, that we have a lot of instruments at our disposal. They are not just military instruments, but economic, diplomatic, and other kinds of instruments that we really have to bring to bear at this particularly difficult time, I think, in the region.
Great. Thank you so much, both of you. Let's jump right in. I mean, Sheila Sensei, right where you left off and talking about both the history and the lessons learned from Okinawa, we can think about what it means today. We just saw President Biden visit Korea and then Japan, specifically for the Quad Leaders Summit, to talk about Japan's global role. And a lot of what Japan's global role is able to be empowered is through the American military bases, the forward projection of force there in Okinawa. So let me start, Gabe Sensei, with you. How would you assess the current geopolitical situation as you sit there in Okinawa and kind of the impact this might have in terms of the region?
Well, currently, the handling of the problems by force is taking place all over the world. extends to the Ukraine and Middle East. And if we include the human rights abuses to China and South America. And the reality is such violence must be countered and controlled by the use of violence. Resolution by discussion is time consuming, and even when it is achieved, it has been followed by violence. The pacifism being called for in Okinawa is not enough to deal with the situation. Nevertheless, we do not believe the effort to avoid the war should be abandoned. Many studies of international politics seek how war can be avoided. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Sheila Sensei, to you in terms of both the current assessment of geopolitics we heard about, obviously, and obviously it kind of overshadows everything, this war in Ukraine. Many Americans forget that Russia is actually Japan's closest neighbor. And also what you kind of the takeaways from Biden's trip to Asia. I mean, in Japan, in some ways, the answer to the question about Taiwan seemed to overshadow in the media the conversation. But a lot of what we're talking about today in terms of Okinawa's key role is relevant. What's your assessment?
So let me save the Taiwan piece, Joshua, for later, because I think we could talk quite a bit about the details of that. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a Washington perspective, since this is where I sit, and unfortunately I haven't been able to travel to Japan for a couple of years. But so President Biden's trip has been in the planning, as you know, for some time, but it realized a certain set of goals, I think, that are probably pretty important for U.S. foreign policy. Presidential visits, of course, as you know, are pretty productive visits. They mobilize attention. They get the bureaucracies focused on what we call deliverables, that kind of thing. But they also bring a certain energy to the leadership relationships among our allies. And this was very certainly a visit to the region that emphasized allies and alliances. And this is, of course, what the president and his team have been emphasizing throughout, which is the United States is coming back to a position after 4 years under President Trump of putting our alliances at the forefront of our strategy. And in that sense, I think he had some interesting meetings. He went to Seoul first to meet with President Yoon, as you know, who barely was in office 10 days before a state visit by a U.S. president. At the end, when we were in Tokyo, Prime Minister Angelisi from Australia had barely been sworn in as the new Prime Minister of Australia before he got in the airplane. So these leaders' meetings, I think they matter. President Biden, of course, had met Prime Minister Kishida before when they were in other positions in our government and Kishida as foreign minister. So they had a nice, warm, comfortable relationship. But I think that was important at the personal level. The Quad was very important. So it wasn't all about U.S. Japan, obviously, in Tokyo. It was a very important moment for the four leaders, the bigger powers of the Indo-Pacific, as we now refer to the region, to come together to talk about what they wanted to be able to do to help provide the needs of the region. The president also took the moment to announce the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which has long been awaited in the region, not necessarily with bated breath, but at least there was an expectation in the region that the United States would bring some sort of economic engagement to the region and not just hard power military engagement. So I think that was interesting. That was interesting to me that he chose to do that in Tokyo along with Prime Minister Kishida, but also beamed in virtually were many of the leaders of the ASEAN countries that the president had met in a summit just the week before. So I think you saw a kind of regionalist kind of approach here on the economic side that I think was an attempt anyway to assuage concerns that the United States has backed away from trade and trade multilateralism in particular. We'll talk more about this later, but the last piece is the obvious piece, and the president did this in both Seoul and Tokyo, which is he directly addressed the extended deterrence piece of the alliances, the United States obligation to defend South Korea and to defend Japan. And this was obviously important to our allies in the wake of the Russian aggression against Ukraine.
So picking up right there where Sheila Sensei left off, Gabe Sensei, can I ask you to comment on the U.S.-Japan alliance? I mean, it's facing a set of challenges that need to be managed to maintain stability. From your perspective, what are the top concerns and priorities for the U.S.-Japan alliance right now?
Well, the first step will be the response to Taiwan crisis. And before COVID-19, this will be hard in North Korea. But now it's Chinese military rise, and which to the U.S. Japan specifically reminds them of the armed invasion of Taiwan. The experts believe that Xi Jinping, who is expected to be the president for another 5 years at the Chinese Communist Party Congress this fall, will try to unify Taiwan during his term. In order to achieve this, the U.S. and Japan have been trying to integrate their militaries. I believe that the increased defense spending of Japan is a step in that direction. The Prime Minister Kishida make a statement at the press conference as with Biden. So the relation with the Taiwan crisis, I think the comprehensive approach of the political, military, economic coordination between the U.S. and Japan with regard to relation with China. The new economic initiative, as Sheila mentioned earlier, IPEF, in the Pacific Economic Framework led by Biden, addressed new areas such as supply chain recovery, standards on the technology, and export controls. The U.S. will probably seek the Japan's strong cooperation in the building and encirclement against China.
Great, thank you. Before we zoom in on Okinawa's role, Sheila Sensei, let me have you answer the same question in terms of the top concerns and priorities for the alliance in terms of, after Biden's trip, but also in the wake of this kind of monumental geopolitical shift we've seen in terms of Russia invading Ukraine and kind of how that changes the calculus for countries like Japan that are in the region.
Thank you, Joshua. I don't disagree at all with Gabe-san's evaluation of the challenges that we face in the U.S.-Japan alliance. I think, Taiwan, a lot of this is our military, as you know, from our Indo-Pacific commanders have been evaluating the accelerated acquisition of military capability by the Chinese. And they are worried. As you'll remember, Admiral Davidson just a couple of years ago surprised our allies, but all the rest of us here as well, by saying within 6 years, it's entirely conceivable that China could take Taiwan by force. So that's the acquisition of capabilities piece. But I think the region, and not just Tokyo and Washington, but the region is getting increasingly worried about what Chinese intentions are. And I think Gabe-san very importantly pointed out the Party Congress that's about to happen this fall, and Xi's desire to continue to maintain his position in power. But there's been some demonstrated moves by the Chinese, the Hong Kong security law and the imposition there, the way in which the PLA is asserting itself around the region against Southeast Asian maritime boundaries, but also most obviously against Taiwan. It's been very conspicuous that there's messages being sent with the military as the primary instrument of communication to Taiwan by Beijing. And it's very unsettling, not only for the people of Taiwan, but for the region as a whole. And then the last piece, I think, is you watch the Chinese behave across the Indo-Pacific, but also across the globe in ways that really emphasize their hard power. We use the word coercive diplomacy to describe, if you don't do this for me, we will rescind our trade with you. So they're using hard power, not just military, but they're also using their very extensive economic power for political gains that worry a lot of people. So I think it's capabilities, but I think it's also Chinese behavior that has us a little bit more focused these days on what if the decision was made, that they might engage through use of force to reunite Taiwan with the mainland. So that's something for the U.S. and Japan to think about. And again, to go back to both Gabe-san's comments and mine as well, is we shouldn't jump on the fact that this is simply a military problem. And I want to just sort of praise the Kishida cabinet and our Biden folks for building a coalition strategy that involves not only other Indo-Pacific nations, but also the European nations on paying attention to what's happening out there in the areas around Taiwan. Again, I won't repeat what Gabe-san's already said, but I think it's very true that the United States and Japan together are working very hard to build a regional coalition and a series of networks that are organized around both maritime stability, but also around supply chains, around connectivity, clean energy, a whole host of areas where the region needs help, but also we need to be connected to the region. And so I applaud that agenda very much, because I think it's not only about China, but it's about the 21st century and the way in which our economies are transforming. And the last point, and we'll end this part here, but I think it's everybody agrees that the Russian aggression against Ukraine has shocked the world. I think most of us thought that that type of aggression, blatant aggression against another sovereign state, an incursion with tanks and that was a part of our past, not a part of our future. And I think it's not just that Russia's behavior seems to have been badly calculated, but it's just that the reality of the use of force has been brought home again in ways that my generation, I think, has never experienced. And so I think this raises important questions about our institutions, our post-World War II global institutions, the United Nations, first and foremost. It's no accident that the G7 now has become the place where the U.S. and its allies are responding, because the Security Council can't. Russia sits on the Security Council and will not allow the Security Council to have a role in either mediating or trying to mitigate the consequences of the violence. So I think there's a whole rattling of the structure of global politics that means that allies like the United States and Japan really have to think carefully about what it is we need to do to shore up our values, but also to shore up the rule of law and our cooperation to prevent this kind of aggression in the future.
Thank you. So Gabe-sensei, let's zoom in to where you're beaming in from. Okinawa's role in U.S. Japan security, and given all the challenges that you both have laid out in terms of a new geopolitical environment, an environment which isn't just with a Russian aggressor, you've got North Korean missiles and you got Chinese aggression all over, and you're sitting right in the middle of all these currents. What is Okinawa's role to the U.S. Japan security relationship?
Oh, yeah, thank you, Joshua. And just before I respond to your question, I just mentioned about the President Biden's visit to Tokyo. Is it okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. Biden's visit to South Korea and Japan, and at the end of May, and the show of the emphasis of the U.S. engagement in Northeast Asia. It was an occasion for two countries to confirm each other, and that they will increase their respective security engagement, especially the President Biden's reference to the U.S. involvement in the Taiwan's defense at the press conference immediately following the Japan-U.S. summit must have been seen as a reassurance to the administration, not only Taiwan, but also the South Korea and Japan. And the Prime Minister Kishida raised a substantial increase in the defense spending on the same occasion. It emphasized that externally, Japan shared the same sense of the crisis about the Russo-Ukraine war as NATO members. Domestically, I think that it provoked a deep debate on how to finance it and what kind of military equipment to build and why it is necessary. So this is now we have facing this kind of discussion in Japan. So now we just moved to the original question of yours, and I just talk about Okinawan's role of in the U.S.-Japan security relations. So Okinawa is occupied important position in the Japan-U.S. security relationship. This is because Japan hosts the largest number of the U.S. forces overseas, the majority of which are concentrated in Okinawa. Imagine if there were no U.S. military bases in Okinawa, the Japan-U.S. relationship would be very different. Not only the area of security, but also in many other areas exist today. In the extreme, it can be said the current U.S.-Japan relation would not exist without the presence of Okinawa as island with a large concentration of U.S. military bases. If there is any objection to this, we should present a new idea to stop the concentration of bases and recommend a major shift in the Japan-U.S. relations. The above is the viewpoint of the seed of Okinawa as a just piece of land. And we must not forget that the Okinawa is a space where people live. Many of people living there have been calling for reduction of bases in order to minimize the damage from the bases. It is reported that there is a growing number of young people who approve the bases. I do not deny there are such young people. In the election, the question is not whether one is for or against the bases. The question is whether they approve or disapprove the basis. The reason for this is that there is an attitude that since the basis exist, it is inevitable, and that the Japanese government position will not change even if they oppose the basis. So that's the role of the Okinawa, role of Okinawa in the U.S.-Japan security relation.
Great, thank you. Sheila Sensei, over to you in terms of kind of Okinawa's role in the U.S.-Japan security relationship as seen from Washington, as somebody who's researched this for a long period of time.
So a couple of thoughts, Joshua, that probably might be helpful for those who are listening who perhaps have never been to Okinawa or have never lived there. I had the great privilege of being there working with Professor Gabe at the University of the Ryukyus for a year in 1998. And of course, that was right after the protests erupted after the rape of a 12-year-old girl in 1995. So it was a very contentious political moment. And I went to understand exactly the question that you're asking. What is the role of Okinawa? Why is the politics between Okinawa and Tokyo so fraught? And when I was preparing to go, I had a lot of friends, obviously, in Tokyo who were security specialists, and some in the government, some in universities. But they said, I don't know, it's very anti-American down there in Okinawa. And when I went down there, nothing could have been further from the truth. So I think there's an awful lot of portrayal of the politics outside of Okinawa that has this kind of broad brushstroke. Everybody in Okinawa is anti-base or anti-American or anti-Tokyo. Everybody is on the left, for example. They don't appreciate the national security importance, and nothing could be further from the truth. So if you go and look at the politics in Okinawa, look at the gubernatorial elections since 1972, you will see that, in fact, the Okinawans have exercised their democratic choices quite effectively. They've changed governments in power. They've had conservative governors. They've had more liberal governors. They have thrown out the people they didn't think were doing a good job. They voted in people who could do a better job. But the consistently important issue, as Gabe-san pointed out, is that the people of Okinawa have had no choice in their role in the U.S.-Japan security alliance. Just as they had no choice as being the first homeland spot where the United States military landed in Japan in 1945. And so I think one of the things that's really important as we think about the security role is also to understand the democratic representation of Okinawa, not only within the prefecture and among different political parties within the prefecture, but also between Okinawa and Tokyo. And I think it's an important piece of the puzzle here. Governor Tamaki today has 62 to 63% support, and that does, whether it's Asahi doing the poll or Yomiuri doing the poll, he has the same pretty much numbers. He's a very strongly supported politician. He's got strong support for his economic policies, for all kinds of other policies other than the base issue. And so I think we ought to think carefully about the messages that we're getting from the people of Okinawa, not as something that represents the left or something anti-something, but the idea here, I think often, is we can come up with more creative solutions, perhaps, that don't impose the burden that is imposed on the people of Okinawa. And I think you've seen since from the 1990s forward, maybe not as fast as many of the residents in Okinawa would like, but you have seen incremental progress. I think the Futenma issue is not moving as quickly as people would like. I think many of the force posture changes that you've seen in the Indo-Pacific have actually reduced the number of U.S. forces in the region, in and around Okinawa. But we also have to recognize the reality today is we're not just talking about U.S. bases in Okinawa, but we're increasingly talking about self-defense force bases in Okinawa. And as Japan's defense posture has changed, you're seeing more and more deployments of self-defense forces in small islands, what Okinawans call Sakijima, the small islands closer to the East China Sea, Yonaguni, Ishigaki, Miyakojima, for example. You are beginning to see Japan's own military believe that they need to be present in different parts of Okinawa in order to defend the country. The language we often don't hear, though, is who is protecting Okinawans. And we talk about the defense of Japan. We don't often talk about, well, what are the implications of this new defense posture? And again, if Gabe-san is right, that Japan is really going to massively increase its spending and reorganize its forces more effectively to deal with this southwestern region, what are going to be the impacts on the people of Okinawa? Is this going to make them more safe, or is it going to create additional burdens? So I think there's a great deal of creativity needed here, because without the support of the people of Okinawa, not just the alliance, but the defense of Japan doesn't work. And I one last point on that, and this is something that's been hovering, and I'm sure your audience knows it, but there is a great deal of focus on increasing ballistic missile deployments in and around the Asian continent to deal with China's, not only China, but North Korea, but China's intermediate range missiles. So the United States decided in 2019 to step out of the INF treaty with Russia, largely because Russia was violating it, but also because China wasn't in it. And so there's a plan to deploy more of these intermediate range missiles around the Asia Pacific. The sites of that, many people worry that Okinawa is once again going to be asked to accept that burden on behalf of the Japanese people. The Japanese government itself is going to consider, as one option of many, its own counterstrike capability. In other words, its own conventional capability that would allow it to have an offensive strike capability against China and North Korea. That too, the placement of where those missiles might go, I think have many people worried that Okinawa once more will be seen as the obvious spot for deployment. So I think you have to have these conversations openly, transparently, and I don't know how we do that in a way that assuages Okinawan concerns that they will continually be the place that people look to, right, to accept weapon systems or bases or deployments that may not be in the interests of the local residents. But we need to do it, and we need conversations like this to be able to discuss what the concerns really are and how we are creatively going to address them.
I really appreciate you kind of putting all those pieces in perspective, Sheila Sensei. I think you're 100% right that oftentimes we talk about Okinawa without the agency of the people there and the democracy that is vibrantly there, which is one of the great strengths and the diversity of Japan. And so rather than trying to hide it in the corner and kind of put all the burden there, I think it's actually something we should be discussing more openly and even painful moments in our past help us learn as two nations and also within nations. So Gabe Sensei, turning to you both for a response to what Sheila Sensei has put out there in terms of Okinawa's agency and also its role, but also, why does Okinawa matter? And explaining that to an outside audience from Okinawa, whether it's the Japanese population, to an American population, but also to an Okinawan population about why Okinawa matters.
Well, just as Sheila mentioned earlier, and the problem in Okinawa is that the will of the people, the basis of democracy, is not reflected in the policy. Why it is so? By making Okinawa part of Japan, Okinawa become a minority, and it's forced to follow the opinions of majority of people on the mainland. From the U.S. perspective, it will be treated as a domestic issue for Japan. Making Okinawa into a domestic issue for Japan was the main reason, one of the main reasons for the reversion of Okinawa in 1971. If the issue raised by Okinawa become hot topic internationally, it may lead a return of the U.S. attention to Okinawa. For example, the rape of a young girl in 1995 brought international attention to the presence of a basis in Okinawa. This was when the stage changed from a domestic issue to an international one. Yeah, and I'll just speak about the strategic importance on Okinawa, and whether it is strategically important or not depends on the U.S. involvement in Asia in a recent round in the Pacific. However, other than Okinawa, which is a military hub in the region, the U.S. has no other hubs. Therefore, if the U.S. were to withdraw from Asia, it has considered retreating to the Guam, Micronesia, or Hawaii. It appears that this is still being considered. There has never been any proposal in Japan other than Okinawa to take over such U.S. military hub. The Japanese government has even failed to install the planned construction of the two Aegis Showa ballistic missile defense sites for the defense of Japan. In the end, both Japan and the U.S. will be forced to seek the military bases in Okinawa. So that's some of my comments on that.
Great, thank you. Sheila Sensei, over to you in terms of why Okinawa matters, and also will it continue to remain a strategically important hub, as Gabe Sensei pointed out, that in some ways depends on Washington's policy and how important Asia is to U.S. foreign policy for the future.
So that's one half of the strategic question, right? Is to what extent will the United States continue to play the role that it's been playing in the region? And I don't anticipate that we are about to throw in the towel soon. I'll just put that out there. But I don't think we're too far away from an administration that raised questions about why can't Japan defend itself, or why can't South Korea defend itself? So I think bubbling up in the body politic, without assigning this to one administration or the other, but bubbling up in the body politic here in the United States are questions that are not usually politely asked. So when I go out to speak in the United States to regional, and I'm sure, Joshua, you have this experience as well, but you go out to speak in regions where, and this is not a Republican or a Democrat issue, it's a question of people who are looking at Washington and saying, why are we still playing this role in the world? Why are we the one that all these countries turn to for help? Why can't they defend themselves? And I think what you're seeing today in Europe is a very interesting conversation as well, about not only strategic autonomy of Europe, but the idea that you can't actually have a strong alliance with the United States, right, without much, much more investment by the European allies in their own defenses, and a certain sense of autonomy in how they relate to each other in defending the democracies of Europe. I think we're going to have that conversation among our Asian allies as well. The difference is we're not in a multilateral alliance in Asia. As we all know, we have a series of bilateral relationships with the United States. But I think there's a time here, and again, much of this will probably depend on Chinese behavior. But we are getting to a time where these security networks that I described already have a momentum of their own. So Japan, Australia, Japan, India, Japan and some of the maritime states of Southeast Asia are doing far, far more today than they've ever done in the past without the United States. That doesn't mean that they're leaving the partnership with the United States, but there's a greater agency, I think, in the region as well by Japan and to a lesser extent South Korea, but also Australia. Why Okinawa matters? Well, geography. If we had a map here, we could put it right up, and it wouldn't even we wouldn't have a conversation about the unfortunate reality of the neighborhood that not only Japan lives in, but that Okinawa specifically resides in, makes it a very vulnerable place. It's far away from Tokyo. It's far away from the main islands. Anybody who's gotten on a plane and flown to Okinawa, it's a 3.5-hour flight, or at least a 3-hour flight. So distance matters. The proximity to Taiwan, to then China matters. Again, for your listeners who don't understand how close Taiwan is to Okinawa, from Yonaguni, which is the island closest to Taiwan, it's about 110 kilometers, I believe. Gabe-san will correct me if I'm wrong. But from Naha, which is where most of the self-defense forces reside on the main island, that's about 700 or so kilometers to Taiwan. That's not very far away. That's less than an hour plane ride for those of us who travel on civilian aircraft. So proximity to Taiwan, proximity to the behavior of the Chinese in the East China Sea, these things are all going to matter, unfortunately. And it's out of the control, really, of the people of Okinawa, how the major powers around it act. I do feel the last piece that we haven't really spent much time talking about, which is how the alliance, the two militaries in the U.S. Japan alliance, are increasingly looking at each other and to each other for support and assistance. In the United States, we hear this word integrated deterrence a lot, but unlike our alliance with South Korea or our alliance with the NATO allies, we don't have a unified command with the Japanese military. Our military doesn't have a unified command. We don't have a common contingency plan. We don't really have an integrated sense of how the alliance would work in a crisis, either to de-escalate the crisis or to actually, if worse came to worse, fight together. I think we're heading in the direction where integrated deterrence is going to be something that both governments are going to be more interested in exploring. And that may give us some opportunities, perhaps a silver lining, that for Okinawa at least, the self-defense forces will take on a much, much greater responsibility, and that base consolidation won't just be U.S. bases being consolidated, but perhaps U.S. forces being consolidated on self-defense force bases for the future. So that makes a lot of sense. It's not something that's going to happen overnight, as we all know. This kind of, revision of the way in which militaries operate can take some time. But hopefully it won't be done in a crisis, and in peacetime we can find a much better, again, more creative solution to the way in which Okinawans today have to live with the presence of U.S. forces in their neighborhood.
Great. Let me ask my last question from my end, and then we've got some questions that I've already been getting from our audience, and I appreciate the questions coming in. Gabe-sensei, what is the outlook for U.S.-Japan relations, and how will Okinawa continue to play an important role from your perspective?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's 50 years have passed since the reversion of Okinawa. And 50 years ago, just the same as when Okinawa returned to Japan, the normalization of the diplomatic relations between the U.S. and China took place. That's a lead to the easing of the Cold War tensions. Now, 50 years later, the U.S. is developing its policy toward China based on the policy decoupling China. And it appears that Japan and U.S. are trying to fortify the Mansa Islands. Mansa Islands means include the Ryukyu Islands and in the other and the chain of islands between the Kyushu and Taiwan. And in effort to hold back Chinese military power in the East China Sea, and also the considering measures for the military involvement in the defense of Taiwan, Japan will probably take a lead in Nansei Shoto, and while the U.S. take a lead in Taiwan, in either case, the U.S. military bases in Okinawa will be indispensable. However, the possibility is not small that strengthening the military power, which is opposed to the data war, may in fact provoke the armed conflict sometimes and escalate into the war. This is a so-called security dilemma. Whether such an expansion of military power will lead to peace and stability is not for Japan and the United States alone to decide. Unless it assumes the peace and stability that China envisions, it will provoke war. I think it is more than half a mistake to think that the U.S. Japan military power will bring the peace and stability. Rather, it is about making China understand what it is that Japan and the U.S. need to protect. Right now, as Sheila mentioned earlier about the people of Okinawa, I hope the people of Okinawa are among those things to be protected.
Thank you. So Sheila Sensei, last word to you for my questions, and I've got a bunch of questions coming in about the kind of your outlook of U.S.-Japan relations and just where you see Okinawa in that conversation.
I think we cannot prepare, Joshua, for any kind of crisis. And here I'm talking about the kind of military crisis in the region without the cooperation of the people of Okinawa. We just can't. It's because of geostrategic location. It's because of the capabilities and the basing strategy and the division of labor, as Gabe-san pointed out, that's emerging in that southwestern region between our U.S. forces and the self-defense forces. But I think it's also really, really important here, and this is where the conversation with our colleagues in Okinawa is so important to remind. We get a little myopic about this because it's very Tokyo, Washington focused. But the kind of security dilemma that Masaki was talking about here, the kind of mindset that the only instrument we've got here is to build up military power, to raise the costs with Beijing, to tell them that they can't take territory, right? They can't take Taiwan by force. I think it's just as likely that will provoke conflict, right, as deter aggression. So there's a balancing act to be had here, and that balancing act and the caution and the voices of caution that we are hearing, not just from Okinawa, but from other parts of Japanese society. But I think it's very important that reminder continues to be loud and clear, that if we get this wrong, the people who are first and foremost going to suffer will be the people of Okinawa. The stepping back from Okinawa, though, Joshua, I think this gets us right back to where we started. And I think it's important to come back to what I think both the Kishida cabinet and the Biden administration are trying to do, is to build a diplomatic and a global coalition that shines a spotlight on what's happening across the Taiwan Straits. And the purpose here is not to antagonize Beijing, but to simply raise the relative costs, not just military, but potentially economic, potentially diplomatic, of using aggression in a similar mode that the Russians have used it against Ukraine. And I think our diplomats and our statesmen are trying very carefully. And I think I want to credit both the Kishida cabinet and the Biden administration for this. They're using very careful diplomatic language to say that kind of use of force is unacceptable and there will be consequences. But the consequences aren't all going to be focused on the U.S.-Japan alliance. We can't do this alone. We really can't. Even if Japan doubled its military spending, this is not something that the U.S. and Japan can accomplish by itself. And we are all deeply, Gabe-san used the word decouple, but we are all deeply integrated with the Chinese economy. The global economy is, will be systemically affected by any kind of use of force that involves China. So I think our interests and our costs and our benefits here have to be very carefully discussed, not only by colleagues in Okinawa, but in the United States and Japan as well. We have to make it clear to Beijing that we will not stand for the use of brute force. But on the other hand, we have to do it in coalition with others around the globe, because this is a systemic problem, not just a small problem in Northeast Asia, where Okinawa resides right next door to what could happen if things go badly. And I think that's the kind of elevation of the voice of the people of Okinawa I'd like to see more of, because I think that voice is in sync with a lot of people around the globe at the moment.
Great, thank you. There's a lot of questions that are coming in, and I think I can generally group these into two general categories, right? Like there's a lot of questions about Taiwan and kind of lessons that you think China is learning from the Russia experience in Ukraine, and also the question about if something crazy, I think is the way one person phrased it, happens with China and Taiwan. I assume they mean a military force, and the U.S. supports Taiwan. Would Japan automatically be dragged in, or would it allow combat operations from the U.S. bases that are only 100, 700 kilometers away that Sheila, you talked about? So Gabe-sensei, let me come to you first with the general lessons, and then also, will Japan get dragged into any contingency that involves China taking Taiwan by force?
Okay, thank you, Joshua. I just, in case of the case of the Chinese invading Taiwan, I can only answer that it depends on the scale and the scope of the Chinese invasion of Taiwan. For example, it depends on whether it is a maritime blockade or the overthrow of the government through the covert operations and the deployment of the ground troops and the scope of the battlefield and so on. Here, in the event of a Chinese naval blockade of Taiwan, the United States will transport supplies, just like doing same things in Ukraine. In the event of especially the transport supply, especially military supplies, including weapons and ammunition. The military supply is very particular but essential. In the case, U.S. transportation to the blockade Taiwan, in particular, Taiwan would be by ship or plane. In the event of the conflict between the U.S. and China, the important point is the extent which force will be used. Either U.S. and China will decide whether to expand the war or minimize the impact of the conflict. Depends on the decision of the other side. The war zone may or may not be expanded. For example, Japan will counterattack the Chinese attack on Japanese territory. But either Japan or China will decide whether it would be an all-out war or whether it would be limited to area and limited to the weapons. Temporarily, only Okinawa could become a battleground within Japan. I see no reason for China to launch only such attack, and I believe that this is the case for all-out war with Japan. So that way, it's very specifically, it's very changing in the scope of the area and then how to limit the use of the weapons. It depends on it's very critical issue. So easy to understand that it seems to be unclear to me right now what kind of the conflict will be, happen in Taiwan Channel. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Sheila, I want to hear your thoughts on this as well, but actually, probably a mutual friend, Mike Mochizuki, has a question directed for you. He said, you mentioned the need for a conversation about Okinawa and strategy. How should that conversation take place? It's clear that Governor Tamaki would like Okinawa to have a seat at that table in such a conversation. So I want to direct that question to you.
Mike has been engaged in facilitating those conversations far longer than I have. Let me try the Taiwan question first, and I wanted to start with this, your questioner who said who referenced an automatic Japanese engagement in the war, and there's nothing automatic about it. There's two mechanisms I think that are important to remember here. One is the United States and Japan have a prior consultation mechanism in the treaty, the U.S. Japan bilateral treaty, in which the United States, if it is going to use Japanese territory for combat against a third country, and or it is going to introduce significantly different combat, constellation of forces to Japanese territory, it must consult with the Japanese government and get permission. So that sounds like a little technicality, but in reality, whatever the United States wants to do through bases in Japan must be approved by the Japanese government. And I don't know if any of you noticed, but in 2017, when the North Koreans were shooting all those missiles, and President Trump and others in Washington were talking about, all kinds of things that they were going to do, the Japanese government quietly had to remind the Trump administration that prior consultation was required, even for a Korean contingency. So there's a formality to it. It's not only technical, though. It does give the Japanese government a certain amount of leverage over the question of how and what facilities might be used by the Americans should that happen. The other piece, of course, is that our two militaries have what's called the guidelines on U.S.-Japan defense cooperation, the most recent version of which got the U.S. and Japan pretty close to an understanding that whatever was necessary for the defense of Japan would be allowable in terms of how the SDF and U.S. forces operated jointly. The real political hurdle, as you all know, is the collective self-defense reinterpretation by Prime Minister Abe and the new security laws. But I still think there's a question, and this is the point that Gabe-san was making, is under what kind of scenario are we imagining the Chinese use of force? And depending on what kind of scenario you're looking at, you could see the United States looking to Japan and to the self-defense forces in particular for different roles, depending on how that developed. So there's nothing automatic about it. And just as a reminder that most of the premises of U.S.-Japan military cooperation, there's lots of exercising, right, around Okinawa, around the East China Sea that would intimate how they could bring capabilities to bear. But the formal contingency planning has largely been focused on a Korean contingency. And so there would have to be some work done there to make sure that the contingency plans on the Japanese and US sides were in sync with each other. I think if there is a use of force across the straits in any form or fashion, we would find ourselves very, very quickly in a great power war. I don't think this would be something that would be minor or slow. I think it would, in fact, accelerate quite quickly if the Chinese really did decide that the moment was ripe for the use of force. I'm not sure I'm convinced that the Chinese will decide that, but if they did, and I think then the Japanese response will be to put the self-defense forces on a defense of Japan footing. Because again, if you look at the map and the geography there, a defense of Japan scenario allows the self-defense forces to do virtually anything they need to do to defend the Japanese home islands in that scenario. And I think that's what any prime minister of Japan would do first and foremost. So lots of people talk about a Taiwan scenario as if there's a little itty bitty Taiwan scenario, but what we're really talking about is major power war and Japan's need to defend itself in that context. The lessons being learned by Russia and Ukraine, I wrote a piece for MBR in their Asia policy on this, and it's too early is my qualifying comment here. It's really too early to draw conclusions about what the Russians or the Chinese or anybody, even the United States, what lessons we are drawing from this. And I think it will largely depend on how this conflict ends. I think we're in the middle of it, and I think it may not be the point at which, yes, there'll be lots of lessons being drawn from military operators, for planning, for logistics, and I'm sure that the PLA is watching the Russians with some amazement, I think, because I think there was great expectation, including here in Washington, that the Russian army was modern, mobilized, and would be highly effective in a scenario in which it hasn't really proven to be. But beyond that, I think the calculus of China's interest, I think, remains to be seen. And I think it's too early, and I wouldn't give up the opportunity to try to shape that learning process. And I only say that because sometimes people jump to the conclusion that, you know, the February 4th agreement between Xi and Putin has largely put China and Russia into the same camp. I think it would be worthwhile for us to assume that that's not a done deal. And we have a lot of influence, as does Japan, as does our European partners, in trying to shape Chinese perceptions of its interests. And I wouldn't give up on that. The one piece that I do write about in the very, very briefly is this question of nuclear coercion. You know, Putin has raised the banner of the use of force, use of nuclear weapons or potentially chemical weapons. I think we don't think very often in the U.S. Japan partnership about actual political use of the nuclear card in a conflict or in an evolving crisis. You're already starting to see intimations the CCP would be ready to sort of threaten Japan with the use of nuclear weapons should it decide to support the United States in a fight over Taiwan. There's some video material that's floating around that the Taiwanese press has talked about. So there will be a lot of disinformation. There will be lots of language. I think there'll be there's both horizontal and vertical kinds of escalation of that nuclear threat that I think we are going to have to think through very carefully on both sides or in the alliance planning mechanisms. To Mike's point, Mike, I wish I had an answer to that, but I do think that the kind of work that you have been doing and have been doing for decades is very, very important. And I think that we need to continue to have forums like this, where we don't put Okinawa out in a box somewhere over there at a regional, local level where it doesn't matter. Where you get into tricky spots where I don't have the answer to that is in the formal government discussions over strategy. I don't know how to do that. You and I have talked about this before. It's very hard to do in practice, but I don't think we should stop trying to have at least conversations like this that allow us to bring out the consequences for Okinawa should this scenario of a Taiwan contingency in particular evolve.
Well, we are actually 2 minutes over, and one thing we pride ourselves on Japan Society is being on time, but this topic is so important, and we have two experts that I've learned a tremendous amount from. I think in many ways I come away feeling a little bit nervous about the world and the place, but I also feel reassured just at how nuanced and how complex and deep the issues are, and how we can't simply see Okinawa as over there or being separate from the defense of the liberal international order, and also thinking about the U.S.-Japan alliance as not just being about Tokyo and D.C., or maybe more specifically Nagatacho and D.C., because it involves other areas, whether that's the other parts of the United States that need to be brought in to the conversation, or other parts of Japan, particularly Okinawa. So I want to thank Masaki Gabe-sensei of the University of Ryukyus, and also Sheila Smith of the Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you for sharing your insights. Thank you for sharing your time with us this morning early in Okinawa and this evening in DC. Thank you to our viewers. Thanks for the questions. Thank you, Gabe-sensei and Sheila-sensei. We hope to see you again soon to continue the conversation. Otsukaresama.
Thank you, Joshua. Good to see you, Gabe-san.